Well, I want to welcome Cameron to the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Natasha. I'm so excited. And I was gushing beforehand, but I love your podcast.
And I appreciate that. So always nice to have people who have listened to my podcast come on. So that's always a
Yes,
good thing.
yes, I love it.
We are going to be talking about something that I need your expertise on, and I know people who listen need your expertise on. Uh, We're going to talk all about sensory today. And a lot of the kids that I work with and that, the parents have kids in the audience, they have anxiety or OCD, but a lot of them also have sensory. It kind of goes hand in hand for a lot of our kids. And even
Right.
though they don't have a sensory processing disorder label, they still have sensory needs that need to be addressed.
Yes, yeah. It's commonly a piece, especially with anxiety, and certainly too with OCD. But there's such a link between sensory processing challenges and anxiety. Like they really, go hand in hand. So.
They do. And I think sometimes parents get overwhelmed because they're like, oh my gosh, my child has so many things. And I'm like, really, they don't. It's
Right.
just, it's just a big ball of everything that fits together. If
Right.
you're sensitive inside and out.
Oh, totally. And, I think it also gets tricky because on one hand, it's helpful to have a diagnosis to give you a framework as a parent for like, okay, how am I addressing these things? But like you said, on the other hand, it can then get sort of overwhelming. Like, wait, my child has anxiety, he has sensory processing, and it's funny when my older son has sensory processing disorder, and even though it's not, it's a formal DSM diagnosis, he struggles with sensory processing issues. And when he was, gosh, how old was he? He was about 2.5, and we were seeing an occupational therapist. And at the time, my anxiety was, I mean, it was just through the roof. I was so worried about him. And I kept asking his OT, like, well, what do you think is going on? Like, I really wanted her to give me a label for it to help contain my own anxiety. And finally, at a certain point, she just sat me down, and I love that she did this. And I loved her whole approach. And she just looked at me and she's like, you need to pull it together. and, and you need to stop. Like, we don't need a label for your son. Giving you a label is not going to change what's going on. You already know what's going on with him. So you really need to let go of that. And that one conversation dramatically reduced my anxiety. I was like, oh, okay. I don't need to put any of this in a box. I just need to tune in to what my child's struggling with and figure out the best way to address that, regardless of whether you want to call it sensory processing or anxiety or what. And for me, that ended up being so, so helpful. Though, like I said, not to say that it's not useful to get a diagnosis, because that can be very, very useful. But sometimes, it just gets a little tricky.
Yeah. And I think, every kid has some sensory needs.
Yeah.
So whether your child has, a label or not, I think it just depends on the parenting, personality too, as far as some people just want to Google everything to death and
Right.
and identify in the community of SPD
Yeah.
versus, my child just what are my child's needs? I love the way that the OT pulled you aside and said that.
Yeah. 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 Like, let's just tune in and figure out what's going on with your kid. And we don't need a name for it. But let's find what those needs are, and then let's collaborate and figure out what are the best interventions to help address it. What's going to make the most difference, what's going to help him the most. And yeah, it was such a great perspective shift for me.
Yeah, I love that. That's better than the OT experience I had.
Oh gosh. Right. No, I know. And I mean, we've had several OTs because we relocated when we moved when my son was 3. And so we were then searching, and sometimes, yeah, it takes a little trial and error to get the right fit. But it makes such a difference when you have someone who really like sees what you're struggling with as a parent, and sees what your child is struggling, and can kind of be like a bridge to help ease both of your anxieties, because
Oh yeah.
all the parenting anxiety that goes along with parenting a child who's got some extra needs.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So today I thought we could go over just how to identify if your child has sensory needs, because most of the people listening may not really understand like what sensory is. It's not really necessarily a sensory audience. And so I thought just identifying our child's sensory needs. And then I thought we could talk about what you do with that. What information, how does that help?
Right. Okay, perfect. So I think a good place to start, and I'll use my own experience, is kids with sensory needs. Usually, if you look back and you kind of track their development from birth, you'll see some patterns. And all of the moms I work with, most of the moms I work with have school-aged kids. So like toddler to school-aged, and they're kind of in the beginning of, maybe the teacher, the preschool teacher or the kindergarten teacher has flagged like, hey, I've noticed X, Y, and Z. And so then when they start backtracking and they start telling me the history of like what the infancy was like, what they were like as a toddler, you see a lot of patterns. So, and this was very true for my son. So, and I should mention too before, because I know off the top of my head, I'm not going to cover every single one, but there's a great like SPD checklist that breaks it down by, infancy, toddlerhood, preschool, where you can kind of go through and they give you a lot of signs, and you can check which ones apply to your child and see if there's a pattern. And that is on the Star Foundation's website.
Okay. Yeah, that would be really helpful. I'll link that in the show notes.
Okay, perfect. So common things in infancy that you hear are, as a child, they were colicky. They cried all the time. A lot of times kids with sensory stuff have feeding issues that go back into infancy and kind of continue into toddlerhood. I'm just going to tell you like things that I hear a lot from moms and also my own experience. So for example, my son, every time I put him on his back to change his diaper, he screamed uncontrollably. And that's a really common sign for kids who, infants, toddlers, children who avoid movement. That's a big sensory red flag. On the flip side, kids who are constantly seeking out movement, like, they're like a bull in a china shop, just they can't sit still and they are rough and tumble, and even more so than a typical child, because all kids like to run around, or a lot of kids. But these kids are like seeking it out. So either avoiding movement or seeking out extra movement. Again, a baby who seems distressed when you change positions, if you put them on their back or even like tilt their head back to wash their hair, that will generally cause a lot of dysregulation in a child who has sensory issues. For school-aged, toddler, preschool, if you have a kid who is constantly biting things, biting people, biting toys, that can be a sign of sensory. And again, all of these things just by themselves are not all too concerning. But when it starts to become more indicative of an underlying sensory issue is when you're seeing multiple of these red flags in one kid. So I want to be clear, because sometimes people can be like, oh, my kid went through a biting phase. Does he have sensory? And unless you're seeing a pattern, it's probably not an underlying sensory issue. Children with sensory issues can be very particular about, they may like to really line up their toys. And this is where it gets confusing because that can overlap with OCD, with anxiety, needing things to be just so. That can be a sign of an underlying sensory processing issue. Let me think of some more, just of transitions. Kids who have a hard time transitioning from activity to activity, that's really common. Meltdowns that are like next level. This is where my child shines in the meltdown department. And this is so common. So if you have a kid, especially a toddler, who, all toddlers are going to have their tantrums and their meltdowns, but a kid with sensory issues, their meltdowns are going to be more frequent and more intense, and they tend to be very difficult to soothe. So it just takes a very long time to get their systems regulated when they go into a meltdown. And I remember with my older son, we were on a trip with my family, and we were in the airport, and he was 20 months, because I know exactly what it was, and he had a meltdown that I am still traumatized by. Like, I can't even describe it. And I just remember looking at my husband. Well, I actually made my husband remove him and go as far away from the boarding area as possible, but we could still hear him. It lasted a good 45 minutes, maybe an hour. He could not calm down. Like, he just couldn't. There was nothing we could do. And that is not typical. If that's happening a lot with your child, then something more is going on. So that's a common hallmark. Kids who will seek out tight spots to squeeze into. It seems kind of random, but that can be a sign. Sensitivity to textures or clothing, tags on clothing, certain shoes.
Yeah.
A lot of that tactile texture sensitivity is rooted in an underlying sensory issue.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what you said, I'm sure a lot of people can relate and have kids who have components of that. And,
Right.
Like my oldest daughter has, you just described her completely. She was the baby that you had to hold like away from you.
Yeah.
She had failure to thrive. She couldn't function. She had like severe sensory issues.
Right.
We needed to get like a feeding therapist and an OT like early on. But then I think about my other two kids, and my Mr. 9, he's got to squish himself in between like the mattresses, and he needs that huge bean bag. But I wouldn't say he doesn't have sensory processing disorder, but he definitely is a sensory seeker, and he gets that comfort.
So he's got some sensory needs. It's not really impeding in his ability to function, but he's got certain sensory needs.
Yeah. And I think, we can take all that, I feel like we can take all that stuff. And if we can really parentally hone in on it and say, what are my child's sensory needs? Let me look at them through a sensory lens, and I can help their anxiety or OCD or their behavior or just their dysregulation through the sensory lens. Because I think, I spend so much time talking about their thoughts. Like, that's my thing, is like change their thoughts, change their behavior. Right. But this is a good pause to say, let's look at them through a sensory lens, and what can we do physically, whether they're hyper or hyposensitive, to help regulate them.
Right. It's so when you think about like a child who's experiencing anxiety, and you kind of imagine, okay, this is a kid who's really sensitive. What's happening in their brain is that essentially their brain is just going into fight or flight more frequently and more readily than a less sensitive kid. And the same exact thing happens for kids who have sensory processing issues. So it's like, their bodies are taking in, or their brains are taking in all this information from their senses, and it's not getting processed efficiently. So all of a sudden this little alarm is going off. This is my way. This is not a scientific way of describing it. This is my way of understanding it. And I think it's a good way to help kind of break it down. So their body's taking in sounds, sights, smells, and for whatever reason, their brain is registering that input as some sort of threat, where it's sounding their little amygdala alarm system, and then they're having this fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And that reaction can look like a severe meltdown. It can look like, you put a plate of food in front of them and two foods are touching, and all of a sudden they're screaming and crying and refusing to eat. It's not that they're being difficult or purposely trying to make our lives extremely challenging as parents. It's that their little brains are saying something is not safe right now, and this is how I'm going to protect you. So a lot of those behaviors that you'll see, like when you said your son likes to be smushed in the mattress, his body is telling him, I need some more input to help get things regulated. And he's found a super adaptive way to go get that input. So as parents, I think when we're looking at the sensory piece, like you said, whether or not it's like, oh, my child has sensory processing disorder, or just, oh, I'm noticing my child has some sensitivity, some specific sensory needs. I think what I found for me that's been the most helpful is taking on this lens of like, okay, I'm going to just be really curious about what is it that my son is seeking out right now, and what are ways that I can help give his body that input, like more adaptive ways, because kids are so smart and so adaptive, and they will find ways. But when they can't find an adaptive way, they're going to find a maladaptive way, to get, but, and so if we kind of reframe what we might perceive as difficult behavior, challenging behavior, obstinate behavior, weird behavior, I can't tell you how many things like my son does, and I'm like, that's weird, like, I don't know what's going on. If we can kind of like dial back our judgments and look at it from like a brain regulation perspective and think, oh, my child's body, my child's nervous system is needing something and he's seeking it out. So what are the ways that help calm his nervous system? And the tricky thing about sensory is that it presents differently for every kid. Every kid has their unique sensory profile and their unique needs. So as a parent, it's going to be a lot of trial and error of kind of collaborating with your child and figuring out what are the best ways to get those needs met.
Yeah, I totally agree, because it can look so vastly different in every kid. And I like what you said about, looking at it from a different viewpoint, because you can't really get a child to not have sensory issues, and I think sometimes we want to like fix it. And
Right.
I know with my oldest daughter, it wasn't fixing her skin. It was letting her know that her skin has some superpowers. Like in my house, we always talk about our sensory superpowers, because we all have a little flavor of sensory issues going on. We just have a name for it now. And getting her to realize like her skin and her tongue are like, that's her superpower. Like she can smell like she can taste a lemon. Like if it was like 1 teaspoon of lemon in a recipe, she will taste that lemon, or her hands will feel clothes instead of her eyes. Like that's how she picks clothes out. Even at 15, it's like, Mom, feel this. I'm going to get these pants.
Right.
So, it's not about her adapting to the clothes. It was like her adapting to her sensory needs.
Yes. Yeah. Like understanding what those are and how to kind of flip it around to where it's a positive. And that is such an important thing too, I think, as parents. And I know this firsthand and from the moms that I work with. that when you have a kid who's really being challenged with sensory processing, you know, it's just extra challenging to parent in a lot of ways. And so we can tend to get caught up in seeing like what's wrong or what's difficult about it. And if we can kind of flip that exactly the way that you taught your daughter and you teach your kids to kind of flip it around and focus on the other side, because everything is like, you know, a coin that has two sides to it.
Yeah.
So there's like the side that's tricky, but then if you flip it over, there's this side that's really amazing. And, you know, like my older son he is just sensitive to everything and nothing gets past him. Like, I mean, he just tunes in to every little thing, and that can be challenging as a parent, you know, but on the other hand, I'm like, wow, he is so perceptive, you know, like he's really scanning his environment and just taking in so much information that is going to be really useful to him if he can channel it, you know. So as parents, we kind of have to work against our, you know, evolutionary biology, which is to have a negativity bias and focus in on like what's wrong and how we're going to fix that. We have to really consciously be making an effort to, when that's happening, because it's going to, and like I said, it's just how we're wired, to intentionally flip that around. So I love that with like the superpower of, you know, being able to feel things and taste things. And yeah, like that might be inconvenient sometimes, but then there's another part of it that's really amazing, you know? I mean, that would be.
And if they can hone in on it, you know, and identify it and realize. And I also think like you can, if you know their sensory needs parentally, you can use that as a coping mechanism for their anxiety or OCD, you know, because like that's something their body seeks anyway. And so knowing what that is, knowing what their sensory diet is or what they need can be really helpful. I know with my son, not to keep talking about my kids, but he would totally look like he has ADHD. Like any fly on the wall in my house would be like, what's wrong with that kid? Why is he running back and forth? Right. But when he is overstimulated or dysregulated, you know, his sensory go-to is activity. You know, and so and he has found a coping mechanism for himself. So he asks for jump ropes, which is really weird, you know. And he just jump ropes around our house, and he you know, and I got him like this huge beanbag, and I got him like this big swing. He's a very active person when he's feeling dysregulated, and that's super annoying, I'll be honest. Like right. Yeah, my husband's kind of like, can you just sit down? Right. You know, just calm down. But when I notice it and I'm in a good mom zen mode, I'll be like, you know, something's not okay with him. Like he's trying to help himself. Right. By the time he gets in between a mattress, he's really not doing well.
Right. That's like his last resort. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when I see the mattress kind of sideways and he's in between, I'm like, oh boy.
Yeah. You're like, okay, we've got to do some.
Yeah. I missed the early signs because he is not okay.
Right.
But I think Absuri knows.
Yeah, like, so he knows, like, he just intuitively knows what he needs, and then he'll go, and I love that. I mean, I love the image of him, like, jump roping around your house. It is, I mean, it's so hard. God, I mean, being a parent is just hard, but it's hard not to get annoyed with our kids, you know, when they're bouncing off the walls or, you know, and my younger son is very much like that. He has ants and stands, like he can not sit still, and he is just constantly moving. And he has sensory needs too, though I would say he doesn't have sensory processing disorder. He just has some sensory needs. And it does get on your nerves, you know. And then my older son, his is more, and this is a great kind of representation of how different it can look between two kids. My older son also needs more of that proprioceptive input, but it's because his body tends to be more sluggish. Like he's got low tone, he tires really easily. And that's all rooted and not to get into this part, but that's all rooted in vestibular processing, which is generally, the foundation of sensory issues. Like if a child is having a lot of sensory issues in different areas, there's generally a foundational dysfunction in the vestibular processing. And that's a big word. And when our OT first said vestibular, I was embarrassed. I'm like, I have no idea what that means. I'm like on the side Googling like vestibular.
No.
Yeah. So if anyone's listening, you're like, what's she talking about? I have a lot of information on it on my site that I try to break down. I try to simplify it so it's easier to digest. But so for a kid like my older son, who's like more sluggish, he's going to seek out that input too, but it looks very different than the way my younger one seeks it out, who he also has a vestibular processing issue, but system is just running a lot faster. It's like his brain is like, he can't keep up with like how fast his system is going. So it looks like hyperactivity. And so I totally can relate to feeling like, oh, if anyone was a fly on the wall, they would think ADHD in a heartbeat, because that is what it looks like.
Yeah.
So, and I think this can be overwhelming, but I think a great thing for parents to know is you can start really small. Like you don't have to feel like, oh, wait, now I have to turn my whole playroom into a gym, or, but there's very simple and easy things that you can do, like having a bin with a jump rope and a balance board and a scooter board, just a few little items that, okay, I'm seeing my child they're showing signs of dysregulation. Let's get that bin out and let me hand them the jump rope. Or with my older son, a lot of times when I see it unraveling, we have a couple little things we do. Like one thing is I'll say, okay, Hunter, let's do the pushing game, because I know his body in that moment like needs some more pressure. And sometimes he doesn't want to do it. I have to, kind of coax him into it. But a lot of times he's like, okay. And so we'll just stand like hand to hand and he'll be pushing, and we literally just push up against each other. And then he tries to push me over. And I don't always intervene, like you said, like when I'm having my good mom days and I'm regulated myself, I can intervene pretty quickly, but I don't always get in that early. But when I can, it's amazing the difference that it makes.
Yeah.
So, you notice the signs of dysregulation, or you notice your child is starting to kind of fall apart, and then you say, okay, I know his body needs X. And then if you have an easy way to quickly intervene and do that, it can totally change the trajectory of the rest of, your afternoon or morning or whenever it is.
Yeah, I completely agree. It really is a time saver if you really play detective and you really figure out what your child's sensory needs are. And then in that moment, if you're having a good mom moment, you give them their needs. I mean, a lot of times I get annoyed with my son, or my husband gets annoyed, and we tell him to be quiet. And then it goes on for like 2 hours because he didn't get his needs met,
Totally.
Yeah. Or my daughter, actually this morning, my youngest, feeling anxious about going to school, she really just needed a deep pressure hug. Now that, I worked with her thoughts and stuff, but really I took 5 minutes to sit down on the stairs and say, come here. And I gave her a really deep pressure hug, and I kind of reset her nervous system. And that's what she needed. Now, if I did that with my oldest, she would have been as stiff as a board, because, that's just not how her needs need to be met.
Right.
But I think figuring out, and like you said, you don't have to have a huge gym in your house. I think it's just about figuring out what does your child need, and leaning into those sensory needs in those moments can be such an added tool to help regulate them.
Right. Absolutely. And I think just as a baseline, and I know this from my own personal experience and from working with a lot of moms, is just just having that knowledge of like, oh wait, hold on, my child isn't purposely trying to drive me insane. Like this is not like, just being like, oh wait, there's something going on that is physiological and neurological. It helps you as a parent kind of discard your judgments and really just be able to tune into your kid better, and then on the other hand, even when we have that knowledge, it doesn't mean we're always perfectly tuning into our kids. I mean, it's impossible, no one can do that. So I work, a lot of my work is just kind of helping moms sort through their mom guilt of like, oh, I feel so bad. My child does really annoy me all the time. And I feel terrible because I know he knows I'm annoyed. And then part of me knows he's not doing it on purpose, but it's just hard. And I think what I always say is, this is the hardest job in the entire world. And we really have to give ourselves some grace and some reprieve. And for me, the times when I'm like, when I have those days where I just cannot tolerate, and I have zero patience, instead of beating myself up, I try to switch it around and go, oh, okay, this is just a sign that I'm depleted and I need to do something to take care of that. Because if I don't do that, then my intolerance is going to last, several more days. And then we're going to have a mess on our hands. So, and it's hard to do, but I don't know. I feel passionate about that point of just moms really going more easy on themselves and also recognizing that if you're losing it back to back with your kids, it's not that you're a bad mom, it's that you need some TLC. So, what is that going to look like? And we're so worried about our kids and we're so focused on helping them and figuring out, what they need. But if we aren't focusing on what's going on with us, there's not going to be a lot of like sustainable progress with our kids, because we have to regulate first.
And we're all human, and like parenting is a totally messy job. And I think we can learn so much from our kids about our own issues. And I think modeling to them, our own struggles and even our own sensory struggles, just having a conversation about that is modeling communication and that we're all imperfect and that we can own our own stuff. Like my oldest daughter has a lot of oral defensiveness, and she eats with her mouth open, like super loud, and she's 15. And so it is loud. And I had misophonia. And so I have sensory issues and I get triggered with like rage when I hear that. And I just tell her, because sometimes I'm not very patient. I'll be like, let me get my headphones before you're going to eat. Or if we're in the car, I'll be like, you cannot eat anymore. I just can't handle it. But then I explain, like, you have sensory issues. Well, this is how like I process noise and it's really overwhelming. Or my youngest likes to bounce a ball lately, a really big ball for her own sensory input, I'm sure, like right next to the couch where I'm sitting. Well, I have sensory issues. So hearing that ball over and over, it's probably my misophonia again. It will make me want to like scream. And sometimes I do. But then I explain to her, you know what? That ball is really making me feel overwhelmed. Like it's causing me anxiety. And she'll be like, why is that ball making you anxious, Mom? And then we have a conversation about it. Like the sound just makes me, like my whole body feels stiff when I hear that sound. So I think it's just being real with our kids, and human and being forgiving. I mean, I have some really ugly mom moments and going back and be like, I'm sorry, that was totally not okay.
Oh, I just had a conversation with Mom about this. And first of all, I so relate to the noise, the misophonia. My number one trigger is noise. And I have 2 boys and they are so loud. And we happen to have hardwood floors and high ceilings. And it's just like, I'm like, what? I'm like, is this my version of hell? Like, have I done
That's a
I don't know what's happening right now. I mean, it is, and the same thing, like I will say, you guys, it is so noisy in here. I'm getting, well, the recent thing that, and it's funny because now my 4-year-old says this, I'll say, I'm starting to feel really agitated. Like that's the word, because that's how I feel. I'm like starting to feel agitated and on edge.
Yeah.
And I'll say like, I need you to go in the other room, or I'll say, I'm going upstairs. So when you guys are done, I'll come back down. But to the point of just, having those bad mom moments where we lose it, we have to understand that that's just going to happen. But the important thing is how we repair it afterwards. And I think this is an area where a lot of us never had this modeled. Yeah. We don't know that it's important to repair a relational rupture when it happens, because no one ever did that for us. Our parents didn't do that. I work with a lot of moms who are like, oh God, I've never even thought about that. And I think that's an important point of like, when you lose it, when the dust settles, just to go back to your child and say, oh my gosh, I was really agitated. I completely lost it. I yelled and you didn't deserve that. And I'm so sorry. And give a hug. And it doesn't need to be like a 30-minute, delving into the whole thing, but just an ownership of like, hey, that wasn't my best moment. And I'm sorry that you were a recipient of that. And I love you. And I think it is so much more powerful than we even realize when we're able to do that. And another thing, which I actually learned this from my older brother and his wife, which I love this. And this was before I had kids. I remember him telling me that when he and his wife had an argument, if the kids were kind of in the vicinity, that they would stop and they would say to the kids, hey guys, we're having an argument. Like they would just like announce it. We're having an argument, FYI. I'm really irritated at mom because of this, and she's really irritated at me because of this, and we're having a hard time talking it out. So just wanted to let you know. And then
that's awesome.
I know. I remember this before I had kids, and I was working as a therapist. I'm like, God, that is genius. And so my husband and I have kind of adapted that to when we have these, a tense moment in front of the kids, we'll just kind of call it out. Like, hey guys, same thing. I'll just be like, I'm really annoyed at dad right now. Like, and then I'll like shoot my husband a look, and he'll be like, okay, well, like we can, we'll debate who's more annoyed. But I'll say, we're having an argument and we're really frustrated. And actually, we're probably going to have to work it out later because we're too frustrated to even talk right now. And that's okay. And, at some point, if that's the case, you really want to come back and model like, and sometimes I, I'm like, I should be an actress. Like we'll fake it just because I need to model like some sort of reconciliation, even if we have. So we'll kind of do like a profile. I'll be like, it's okay. Like you were upset and that's okay. Like give him a hug and he'll say, give me a hug in front of the kids so they see. And then, we haven't really resolved it. Then later, when they're not around, then we'll finish talking. But
that's great.
I think and this is, again, is my personal experience, having a child who's got some extra needs that are really challenging, it really puts an additional strain on the marriage a lot of times. And it like tension is just running higher, and stress levels can be elevated, especially if your child is really dysregulated. And we go through little waves where my older son will kind of just go through these waves where things really seem to escalate, and it'll last like a couple months, and and then it'll kind of regulate again. So when we're in one of those like rough patches, which is like a way of saying it, it's harder to stay connected as a couple. And so, and this is totally, not directly related to the topic of sensory, but I feel like a lot of couples who have kids with sensory issues experience that, where they may disagree on what's going on with their child. They may disagree on how to handle what's going on with their child, and it causes tension. And the thing is, and not to, add to, parents' guilt or worry, but when you have a child who's more sensitive and whose nervous system is more sensitized, when there's tension in the marriage, when there's tension in the household, it's just going to exacerbate it. And, it's kind of like this catch-22. So I work a lot with the moms that I see on just like, how can you better manage that stress and that tension so that there's just more of a sense of calm in the household, so that you have more reserves to deal with the sensory needs.
Yeah, which totally makes sense.
Yeah.
So where can people find you? Because it sounds like you have a lot of good resources and you work with these moms.
Yeah, so I have a website. It's called Sensory Mom. So just sensorymom.com.
Okay.
And that's the main place people can find me. And I have a Facebook page. I'm a little slow to the social media. I don't have Instagram or anything, but I do have a Facebook page, so you can find me there. And I do blog for understood.org, which is a great and amazing resource for parents. And their focus is more on attention and learning challenges, but they have a lot of information too about sensory. But there's a couple other sites that I reference a lot. One of them is Your Kids Table, which is an amazing site. And for parents who have kids with feeding issues and eating issues, this is like the number one resource. It's amazing. And
Your Kids Table, not to interrupt you, they are actually doing a webinar this week.
Yes.
And so that is a really good one to catch, because they do free webinars like once or twice a year and go over just all like approaches on how to help kids with sensory issues, or even if your child just has behavioral issues, they can give you approaches. So I'll leave a link in the show notes for their webinar, because it's free all week and you can catch it. So yeah, go on. I didn't want to interrupt you, but
she is such an amazing wealth of knowledge. I don't know her personally, but I feel like I do because I use her site so much. And that's a wonderful resource. And there's another great resource that I direct a lot of my moms to, and that's called Lemon Lime Adventures. And she's got a lot of great articles on sensory and sensory needs and parenting a child with sensory processing.
And that's also a good one, because she is also coming out with, I'm like a little promoter for them, but Dana from Lemon Lime Adventures, she's the one that does Calm the Chaos, and Calm the Chaos is coming out again next month. And I'll be talking more about that as she does her free series in March on how to help kids with like just behavior and dysregulation. So there'll be more to come on that as well. So you can check out her website, because definitely it's a great place to start.
Yeah, I know. There are so many great resources. I feel like, parents who have kids where you're kind of like, something is off, I'm not quite sure, check out the sensory checklist. And if you notice a pattern, then my opinion is that the next step is to find an OT in your area who's certified in sensory integration and set up a call. I mean, you can just do a consult over the phone and share what's going on and see if they would recommend doing an evaluation. If there truly is like an underlying sensory piece that's causing a lot of dysfunction in your child, then doing intervention with an OT who has that sensory integration perspective is going to be such an amazing intervention. Yeah. And not to say that's the only intervention, but it's a great place to start when you're addressing sensory needs.
Definitely. Well, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. My pleasure.